for the Agile community. www.Agile.FM. Welcome to another episode of Agile.FM. Today I have Harold Shinsato with me. He's an independent software craftsman, coach, facilitator, speaker, culture hacker. There's a laundry list, co-founder of the Montana Code School, the co-author, not co-founder, but co-author of the book, OpenSpace Agility Handbook. He's a board member of the OpenSpace Institute. He's a software development expert, and based on his Twitter account, which we're going to get to here in a little bit. His personal interests, he's a drummer and a pilot. We're going to talk about that as well. Welcome to the podcast, Harold.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jochen.
Awesome. You are a pilot, and I don't know what kind of airplanes you operate, but you're also a software development expert. My first question is, do you trust the software in your cockpit?
I've flown only in airplanes with zero software.
But that's not because you don't trust the software.
I guess I trusted the software on my phone.
Okay. Wonderful. You're also a drummer. Any particular style of music you enjoy?
I'm embarrassed to say I mostly like doing drum circles, which can sound kind of hippie, but I enjoy doing African drumming in drum circles.
Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. Circles, right? And we're going to go to circles when we talk a little bit about OpenSpace. So maybe that's the link. Yeah?
Correct.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about some of those things I just mentioned in the introduction here. And one of them is that a culture hacker, and maybe some of the listeners on Agile.FM might not be familiar what that means. What is a culture hacker? How would you define this?
I like the term culture hacker. I went to MIT, and the hacking culture was born there. Mm-hmm. And there's a playful element to hacking, and it's really not about black hat kind of marginal criminal activities. It was simply, hacking was about playing with systems where you don't worry as much about authorization, but you're not doing it with any criminal intent. So a lot of pranks at MIT were things like disassembling a Volkswagen and reassembling it on top of the dome. But a lot of hacking was simply just being really late at the facilities, working on the mainframe. When I was there, there wasn't as much personal computing going around, but working with the VAX machines or something and playing Zork and doing things. It was just playing around. So culture hacking is about finding ways to improve the culture in a more playful, experimental way. And I've removed that from my LinkedIn because it's not quite as appealing to people who might necessarily want to bring someone into their system. So I'm happy to use that term on my Twitter account, but yeah, I'm thinking that it might be time to grow up a bit.
Well, there's definitely, some people might have a negative association with the word hacking or hacker, right? And then in combination with the culture, but there's something serious about it, as you just mentioned, and that is obviously, finding ways to improve, and maybe some of those are a little bit not so conventional. Maybe that's the piece of it.
Well, I see open space technology as a incredibly powerful culture hack. In that it is pretty easy to play with systems, even large systems, using it and make things better without overly waiting for everyone to agree on anything.
That's right.
Other than, you can come and check it out.
Yeah. No, it's a perfect way. And I came across a book with 24 work hacks or culture hacks, and there was also one was the open space, which we can also talk about in a little bit. But before we go there, there's another thing I mentioned. I just want to make sure that we're clarifying some of those teams. So you're a co-active coach, right? So
That's correct.
There's a program around it. What does that entail, and what is a co-active coach? And we're going to put these things together here in a little bit, but maybe just in terminology. Not everybody listening to this is familiar with the co-active part of coaching.
Most people have heard about coaching, but don't necessarily have clarity about the professional element of coaching, which has been developed through the International Coaching Federation. My understanding of the origins of a lot of the current culture and professional coaching community kind of came out of Werner Erhard's work in EST, which now shows up in something called the Forum.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that was about getting into effective conversations to help people claim and own responsibility for their own lives and their work. The original term of coaching was to put someone into a coach with horses in front of them, but using that as a metaphor to help them get through exams in England and pass exams. So the coach would not be taking the exam, but they would help them get through the exam. So that's a lot of the sports coaching work is the coach doesn't play the game, but they help the teams play effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And a coach, a professional coach, and especially a co-active coach, is very much about a partnership. And that's the co-element.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not only restricted to co. The co part is about collaboration and cooperation and doing things together. But it's kind of a yin-yang kind of thing. So there's also helping people stand alone and understand that there's an element of active work that people might need to do. So there's a dualism in coaching work.
Right. And then just in contrast to what you just said about the more conventional definition of coaching was there's the preparation for passing an exam or anything, right? How would that look like in a co-active coach, in a more like in a partnership model? Is there anything different around that?
So a typical coach understanding in sports metaphor is a lot more of an expert model. So the coach is an expert at football, but they may not be a star athlete anymore. So I've loved this term I've heard recently from Dr. David Drake, and he is someone who teaches narrative coaching, which I think is a very useful approach as well, which is post-professional. So the coach is now post-professional football star or performer, and they're supporting others. They might not be able to do a touchdown anymore, but they know how to help people.
Right.
In the coactive model, your level of expertise is not in what the person is necessarily really strong at, but being an expert in development, in psychology at some level, but not being a therapist, to support them in any endeavor without needing to be an expert at all.
Yeah. So how could companies, organizations out there use something like co-active coaching? Is this more like for an HR department? Is this for management? Is this one-on-one? Is this team? Or is this a little bit of everything?
Well, one thing I believe is important to be aware of is that the coactive model has infected the Agile coaching community pretty heavily through the work of Lisa Adkins and Michael Spade and the Agile Coaching Institute. I know that's the Agile Coaching Institute has been acquired by a consulting company, but I still respect their efforts in bringing a more professional coaching stance and not just a pure expert stance into coaching. So a lot of Agile coaches have some background in coactive work, and it's certainly in professional coaching where you're not only an expert in agility, but also an expert in a more collaborative approach of holding space for someone's development and helping them move forward without having to know everything about the software base or the ecosystem that they're a part of. I mean, it always helps to know the language of the domain, but we really overestimate the need that we have to fully understand their problem in order to support them to get through it. There's so many commonalities to just the process of getting better at something, at anything that coaching can support people with.
Right. So one thing I'm like interested, I want to maybe connect you here with the Montana Code School you have co-founded. What's interesting here, I looked it up. Montana, I'm based out of New York, right? Highly populated part of the United States. Montana, on the other side, it's 7 people in average per square mile. So not so populated, right?
I like to call Montana, which the code is MT. I like to call it the empty state.
The empty state. But there are actually 2 more states, I looked that up too, that are actually less populated. But like in the style what you're describing of face-to-face and coactive coaching where people need to come together and do this, what kind of impact does that have for you in the Agile world being out of Montana and also for your Agile community work you're performing in that state? Maybe connecting a little bit that part of the country with the work you're doing and the challenges.
Well, something that's very interesting, being in Montana really helped me develop. I was born in New York City. I have family there, and it's going to be fun seeing them when I get to speak at your conference in New York City. And then I got my really serious programming job at Xerox in Xerox Park in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is also heavily populated. But it wasn't until I got to Montana that I could really start learning about how to impact systems and starting a user group, then starting to learn about unconferences and thinking I want to do my own. And I learned about it at the Java 1 conference, but I actually did it in Montana and started with 15 people and just doubled every year. And then I just started becoming really aware of the value of the origin of unconferencing, which was OpenSpace technology. Got very serious with it. And it's become something that I see as being very valuable, and that's helping the Agile community, the whole Agile community evolve, learn about useful practices, ways of thinking, collaborating with each other. And this is really, really valuable for the Montana Code School in that my involvement in OpenSpace helped me do an OpenSpace at the University of Montana, which helped me be pulled into starting this code school. And some of my OpenSpace work helped them use a model that helped engage the local business community to use something called Lean Coffee, which is like a mini OpenSpace. The community used this to realize, as they voted up again and again, that they really wanted a code school in Missoula, Montana. So that helped that get created. And
it's fantastic.
And this kind of coactive, collaborative, open space-like approach was really essential in helping the students start stepping up into their own responsibility for their own careers, rather than becoming overly dependent on the teacher or some expert.
Right. So I guess it's all about the quality of interaction rather than the amount, right? And I think this is evidence. Like even with a small group you started, I mean, it's growing, even in a state of Montana where people have to go far distances possibly to connect, right? This is awesome. And so I'm just curious, from the technical work you just mentioned, the Xerox Park, I'm not sure if that was like in Sunnyvale, California, I would assume, right? This is where everything spun off. You're a very technical person, and obviously also through the Montana Code School, but then there is this other aspect and all these things we have been talking about so far: culture hacking, coactive coaching, and OpenSpace as another thing. You have even co-authored this book. So these are very 2 different kind of extremes, like the interpersonal part and obviously the technology part. Why does that intrigue you and drive you so much to these two extremes?
I actually don't see them as extremes, and it's going to be a part of the talk in New York City, which is that what's happening is our capacity, and this is true for all technology work. The technologies of the community are what help the community evolve in their understanding. And a lot of people like to poo-poo some of these other things as touchy-feely.
Exactly, yeah.
However, what we find in the evolution of science, moving from pre-science to science, as Thomas Kuhn talked about in his study of the history of science, is that as they get more into dialogue, they start coming more into a coherent model that there's some level of agreement on founding axioms or paradigms that they can then start producing results. And this is inherent in software. Software is being built on agreed upon structures that help the bits flow. And until you get to that level of coherence, especially in what they call the so-called soft sciences, it's harder to actually make real progress. And software is demanding this rigor. It's really demanding it. And like, we have had a lot of intuitions about what is needed to help collaboration be effective without necessarily proofs. But the work of Google was very exciting from their Project Aristotle research to show that there's a kind of almost protocol that's needed to help people and teams to be effective, to have what they call psychological safety, but it's like a protocol of somewhat equal presence on the communication bandwidth of the team. So this to me is not, they're not extremes at other ends. They're actually very integrated, and they follow each other, and they always have.
Yeah. Well, so let's say part of the coactive coaching, right? So just to take an example, is also about the listening and the change in listening to each other. And then correct me if it's maybe it's just me, but the industries, IT or non-IT, everything seems to be moving a little bit faster in recent years, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But I feel like we make a lot of decisions based on headlines only. Rather than, I think that the speed of decision making is catching on. What is the impact on coactive coaching, right? So there are some certain elements that require certain things of standing back, and let's say the listening as a part, right? Be here from you, like a certain calmness to the approach. But what do you think is the impact of that, the current development, the industry way? And you can just pick the technology if that's okay with me, right? But I think it's across the board for all the industries. What do you think is the impact on that, on coactive coaching? Do you think it's going to flourish more, or do you think it's actually going to be challenged by the speed of execution of decision making?
So that's a very deep, complicated question.
I'm sorry.
So just to maybe go at this a little.
Yep, dissect it. Yeah.
It's going to be profound, but it's shallow at the same time, which is that this apparent paradox of going really, really fast, similar to the paradox of just everything going into the cloud, into computing.
Exactly.
This paradox is that the more you go really fast, the more it's necessary to know how to be really, really still. And the more that we get super, super good at computing and robotics, the more requirement the whole overall system is demanding us for starting to understand our humanity. So if you think about it, there's really little way to get effective signal if you don't have a good ground. Well, that's just inherent in communication technology.
Yeah.
This inherent in computing. You need a ground. well, the same is true socially. We need to have a ground, and that ground is the common space that where we can all recognize where the signal is. And if we don't have that ground, then we can't communicate and we can't go fast. So that requires that we have that ground, and that's similar to what I see as being why open space technology is so foundational, is because you just say, well, let's temporarily suspend our awareness of all the social structures and hierarchies, suspend that for a bit, put everyone on an equal ground so that we can entertain where they're at. It's kind of a group mindfulness exercise.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. I myself do quite a bit of open space facilitation, like on site with clients, like privately, and we're doing one in a conference as well. We've been doing this for many years, and there's definitely something to it, right? So whenever you invite people and you have an open space, they walk away by the end of it. The participants, if that was their first experience with open space, as something like an aha, and it was good to step back, and it was good to take the time to discuss these topics and have a really better alignment of ideas and so forth. So there's definitely some grounding going on in open space. You wrote the book and co-authored the book, the OpenSpace Agility book. You are the board member of the OpenSpace Institute, or a board member of the OpenSpace Institute. OpenSpace obviously impacts you in all parts of your career. How do you see this flourish, open space in organization? I just want to hear what you think, possibly working with clients or in conferences. How do you think that could possibly flourish organizations, improve their coaching stance or human values, or however you want to define this? What do you think open space brings to them?
I'd love to answer that question just briefly before I do.
Sure.
I think it's valuable to be aware that open space has been really an early adopter thing socially, as opposed to early majority. So by and large in the software industry, Agile is late majority. At least, just people doing Scrum, or at least knowing about the Agile Manifesto and trying to do Agile. But most people and most organizations aren't even have a clue or have never heard about open space technology.
I agree.
Even though all of them in their childhood have sat around campfires or sat around in circles playing Duck Duck Goose or some other awareness of circle technology. And it's certainly a core element of indigenous culture. So in some ways, open space technology is really going back to basics. It's almost like a little kindergarten lesson. Well, let's practice listening to each other a little bit. So in terms of how this is moving into organizations, so much of the way organizations are structured today have come out of the church hierarchy or military hierarchy. We all know about that. We all know that we're moving into flatter structures and trying to get more engagement, and we're trying to get people to take more responsibility for the work that they're doing and encourage empowered cultures, etc. And all of these hierarchical structures have always been designed to essentially firewall off responsibility. And so how do we help get people to take ownership of the overall organizational goals? And I'm very convinced, I've seen it work, that open space is going to be a core process in that. And that if it's in the near future it's going to be moving into the early majority, and people will just know this is something that's available to us to try.
Yeah, I agree, because I haven't met anybody yet who went through it the first time through an open space who hasn't said after the open space was completed that they want to do it again. so so I think that is the evidence of people will spread the word and they like it and they see the outcome. And we had some really emotional responses even to open space where people felt extremely productive and so forth. Do you have any, just like because you're so exposed, and the answer might be a simple no, but maybe because you're so exposed to the OpenSpace Institute and everything, are there any kind of metrics or measures that link this kind of style to, and maybe even servant leadership and autonomy in addition to that, to increase productivity and so on? Is there any kind of hard data that could support that?
Oh, so there is some in terms of, I mean, it depends on how you define hard data.
Yeah.
But what I'm excited about applying and inviting open space practitioners into is a kind of state of open space survey, similar to what Puppet Labs has done with the state of DevOps, because they're tuning into hard science, in my opinion, hard science, provable science around the effectiveness of surveys and how to design them properly with psychometrics and get useful metrics. And what's interesting is you get a better baseline for cycle time, lead time, mean time between failure by asking people questions rather than trying to plug into their systems, which I had never considered before. But that the things can always be gamed, but
Of course, yeah.
it's a lot easier to set baselines and get useful information by just talking to people, even if it's subjective, and getting enough people into the survey than what happens when you need to get a uniform definition technically of all the systems and when's the beginning, when's the end, and just having conversations around Jira metrics.
Yes.
Very frustrating. Very long process. And, machines can lie.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so it's been really it's been a pleasure talking with you, Harold. But before we close out, I do know you speak at a lot of conferences. You come to New York in September the 5th to the Agile Day, which is, by the way, available, the whole program at agileday2018.org. You come to New York and you will present at that conference, but you also present at other conferences. Is there anything you would like to see based on your experience with those things we just discussed and touched on? Is there anything you would like to see change in these Agile conferences around the world? And maybe let's just start with the next one, the Agile 2018. I don't know. Are you going to that conference? And
Yes, I am. I am.
Okay, so maybe we take that as an example, or we take other Agile conferences you have seen or you see that are lined up. What do you like to see increase, and what do you like to see decrease?
I believe that the awareness of open space is steadily increasing. They've actually used open space in the big Agile conference at the end day, which is like fascinating to watch. There's also what they call the Open Jam in the big conference. And that's actually interesting because that's where the experts go. They don't go to all the other experts talking because they usually already know what the experts are talking about, but they want to hang out with the other experts and maybe come up with new stuff. And that would, I say, is what I think would be useful for more people to be aware that they can not only quickly evolve their understanding by connecting to experts rather than just maybe watching them talk on YouTube or go to a conference where people are talking where you might as well just have done it on YouTube.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just like the more we get to be in conversation with each other, like open space is like one long coffee break, the more rapidly we are getting information, much more rapidly, because you're getting very quick feedback when you're in conversation, and the you can drive in a conversation. If you try to drive when you're just watching and there's no feedback, I mean, how can you direct the car to get anywhere?
Right.
It's very, very slow.
Mm-hmm. So definitely an increase on OpenSpace and OpenJam.
Yeah, and I think that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it needs to change. It just is changing.
Yeah. Do you like to see something go away?
Less jockeying for position and trying to become rock stars. I don't think there's a lot of value to the community for people racing to the front of the parade. I'd definitely like to see less of that.
Okay. Awesome. Let's see. Maybe Agile 2018 is the start of all that. And do want to say thank you, Harold Shinsato. And again, people can reach out to the show page on Agile.FM, and this is where all the links are to your books, to your code school, to the OpenSpace Institutes, and so forth, and obviously the book you co-authored. I'm looking forward to our event in September in New York. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.